Hello everyone. In this video, we will be talking about Lady of the Lake. This has to do with the King Arthur legends I have been discussing. Lady of the Lake is a name or title used by several either mermaid or mermaid-like but human enchantresses in the matter of Britain. The body of medieval literature and mythology associated with the legend of King Arthur. She plays several important roles in many stories, including providing Arthur with the sword Excalibur, eliminating Merlin, raising Lancelot after the death of his father, and helping to take the dying Arthur to Avalon. Different sorceresses, known as the Lady of the Lake, appear concurrently as separate characters in some versions of the legend, since at least the post-Vulgate cycle. Consequently, the seminal Le Morte d'Arthur, with the latter describing them as hierarchical group, while some texts also give this title to either Morgan or her sister. And briefly we'll talk about her name, and I'll get more to it later in the video. And basically her name is Viviane. Some sources also say Nimue and Nin and Nain. And there are these certain words that originate from, because there's a French way they say it, and as it went through different parts of Europe. And also, Viviane, for instance, used in the French Arthurian romances, was ultimately derived in a corruption of Chuifuian, also spelled Huimlian and Chuiblian in medieval Welsh sources. So according to that, that is where the origins of her word comes from. Because as things are translated into different languages, you'll get different things, how things are pronounced differently. And the meaning of this was a wanderer of pallid countenance, which was originally applied as an epithet to the famous prototype of Merlin, a wild man figure Merlin Wilt. In medieval Welsh poetry, due to the relative obscurity of the word, it was misunderstood as fair wanton maiden, and taken by the name Midrin's female captor. Others have linked the name to Nymench with the Irish mythology figure Nymph, an otherworldly woman from the legend of Tir na Nog, and the name Niniane, which is believed to be linked to a saint and the river Ninain. Further theories connect her to the Welsh lake fairies, known as the Grogred Ann, including a Lady of the Lake unrelated to the legend of Arthur, the Celtic water goddess Diana, worshipped in Romano-British times as Cov and Tina, and the Irish goddess of the underworld, Befin Beben, mother of the hero. It has also been noted how the northern Caucasian goddess Satanaya from the Nart sagas is both associated with the water and helps Scythian hero Batraz gain his magic sword. So we can see now her name and the different links that she has to different mythological figures and similarities in the stories from the King Arthur sagas. And the mythical Greek sea nymph Thetis, mother of the hero Achilles, similarly provides her son with magical weapons. Like the Lady of the Lake, Thetis is a warrior spirit who raises the greatest warrior of her time. Thetis' husband is named Peleus, while in some tales the Lady of the Lake has the knight Peleus as her lover. Thetis also uses magic to make her son invulnerable, similar to how Lancelot receives a ring that protects him from evil magic. That reminds me of the Lord of the Rings ring, by the way. The Greek myth may therefore have inspired or influenced the Arthurian legend, especially since the Iliad involving Thetis was well known across the former Roman Empire and among medieval writers dealing with Celtic myths and lore. The Roman fort Avalon, known to Roman Britons as Avalon, and today seen by some as the location of the historical Avalon, has also curiously dedicated the Roman water goddess Dea Latis, and also Lancelot the knight. He was mentored and adopted and somewhat in a sense stolen by the Lady of the Lake, and she raised him and taught him everything. And also in these legends, it was believed that Lancelot was a descendant of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, and in Christianity, Jesus was not married to anybody, but you had some people and some thinkers that thought that he and Mary Magdalene had descendants. And also the Lady of the Lake. Following her early unnamed appearances in the 12th century poems, the Lady of the Lake began featured by this title in the French chivalric romance prose by the 13th century as a fairy godmother type foster mother to the hero Lancelot. She inherits the role of an unnamed aquatic fairy queen, so Lancelot was in this enchanted otherworldly realm, and she taught him wisdom, courage, and overseeing his training to become a excellent, surpassed warrior. She also rears and orphaned his cousins, Lionel and Bourse, after having her sorceresses, damsel Sarade. She rescues them from King Claudius. All this takes her only a few years in the human world. Afterwards, she sends off the adolescent Lancelot to King Arthur's court as a nameless white knight due to her own affinity with the color white. Through much of the prose Lancelot, the lady keeps aiding Lancelot in various ways during his early adventures to become a famed knight and discover his true identity, usually acting through her maidens, serving as her agents, messengers. She gives him her magical gifts, including a magic ring, a protection against enchantments, a manner similar to that to his fairy protectress in Cretion's poem. The same of another of her magic rings also grants Lancelot's lover, Queen Guinevere's, immunity from Morgan's power. Later on, she works to actually encourage Lancelot in Guinevere's relationship and its consummation. Now, in theory, just if this was an alleged angelic being, it would not be encouraging him to do something like that. It would try to steer him away from doing something like that because the queen was King Arthur's wife, and that's something that would be considered a no-no in Christianity. So it's interesting to see these beings do these kind of things. There is an incident a long time ago, not this time period, but a little bit afterwards, where these two British thinkers got a crystal ball from an angel, and the angel is trying to get one of them to go with the other one's wife, and they figured that the angel wasn't from God if it was encouraging them to do stuff like that. So always test the spirit. And I know this is a legend, it may not even have happened, but that is just an interesting fruit for thought. The other thing that she did was including sending Guinevere a symbolically illustrated magic shield, the crack in which closes up after the queen finally spends her first night with Lancelot. She furthermore personally arrives to restore Lancelot to sanity during some of his reoccurring periods of madness, on one occasion using the above-mentioned shield to heal his mind. Another interesting thing in this legend is Viviane's daughters, and she is of the water, and the three daughters are associated with the mothers of Lancelot, of Arthur, and Gawain, and she is allegedly a descendant of Mary Magdalene. Merlin's beloved lover and captor. The Vulgate cycle is first to tell of either a different or the same lady of the lake in prose Merlin delivered section. It takes place before its main Vulgate Lancelot section, but written later, linking her with the disappearance of Merlin from the Romance tradition of Arthurian legend. She is given the name Viviane, or similar, in human origin, although she is still being called a fairy. In the Vulgate Merlin, Viviane refuses to give Merlin, who at this time is already old, but appears to her in the guise of a handsome young man, her love until he has taught her all his secrets. Basically, she wanted to charm him and get him to say all the secrets he has, very similar to Samson in the Bible. And Delilah was the one that he slept with, and she cut off his hair, and that was the source of his strength, and he was deceived by her, and they were able to defeat him, but eventually Samson did defeat them, even though he lost his eyes. After Merlin gives the secrets, she uses her power to seal him by making him sleep forever. The post-Vulgate revision changes into Viviane, causing Merlin's deletion out of her hatred and fear of him. Though Merlin knows beforehand that this will happen due to his power of foresight, he is unable to counteract her because of the truth this ability of foresight holds. He decides to do nothing for his situation other than to continue to teach her his secrets until she takes the opportunity to get rid of him. And it's well known with Merlin that he had a weakness for women. Consequently, she entraps and entombs her unresting mentor within a tree, in a hole underneath a large stone, or inside a cave, depending on the version of the story, as it is told in the different texts. In the Prophéties de Merlin, for instance, Viviane is especially cruel in the way she disposes of Merlin, and then takes Tristan's brother, Meledius, the younger of her actual lover. There she is proud of how Merlin has never taken her virginity, unlike what happened with his other female students, such as Morgan. The prose Lancelot explains this by a spell she puts on her groin which, as long as it lasted, prevented anyone from deflowering her and having relations with her. The Lancelot, too, has Viviane leave Merlin for another lover. In this case, the evil king, Brandon of the Isles, whom she teaches some magic that he then applies to his terrible castle, Dal Aureus Guard. In the Vulgate Merlin, Incognito, Viviane abruptly turns King Brandigor's son Evadim into the deformed dwarf knight for refusing her love. Conversely, the Liberté d'Artis, a late variant of the prose Lancelot, shows a completely peaceful scene taking place under a blooming hawthorn tree, where Merlin is lovingly put to sleep. by Viviane, as it is required by his destined fate that she has learned of. He then wakes up inside an impossibly high, indestructible tower, invisible from the outside, where she will come to meet him there, almost every day or night, a motif reminiscent of Ganedia's visit of Merlin's house in earlier versions of his life, as described by Gorafy in the Vita Merlini. In any case, as a result of their usually final encounter, Merlin almost always either is deleted or is never seen again by anyone else. Only in recently found alternative Bristol Merlin fragment, she resists his seduction with the help of magic, a magic ring during the week they spend together. This particular text ends with him reuniting with Arthur, and to me that makes the most sense because in the canon legend, Merlin is at the time period of Arthur's deletion, or whenever he's taken away to Avalon. He may have not have been deleted, but he was going to be deleted. And then Merlin turned into a bird and flew away, never to be seen again. So he had to have survived this encounter in legends. According to her backstory, in the chronologically later, but happening earlier, plot-wise, Vulgate Merlin Viviane was a daughter of the knight Dionys, and a niece of the Duke of Burgundy. She was born Dionys, domain that included the fairy forests of Brisk and Dornities, and it was an enchantment of her fairy godmother, Diana, the huntress goddess, that caused Viviane to be so alluring to Merlin when she first met him. The Vulgate Lancelot informs the reader that, back in the time of Virgil, Diana had been a queen of Sicily that was considered a goddess by her subjects. The post-Vulgate suit, D. Merlin, describes how Viviane was born and lived in a magnificent castle at the foot of mountain in Brittany. As a daughter of the king of Northumbria, she is initially known as the beautiful damsel huntress. In her introduction episode, in which she serves the role of a damsel in distress, in the adventure of the three knights separately sent by Merlin to rescue her from kidnapping, the quest is soon complete by King Pellinore, who tracks down and deletes her abductor. The post-Vulgate rewrites also describes how Diana had deleted her partner, Faunus, to be with a man named Felix, but then she was herself deleted by her lover at the time, which came to be called the Lake of Diana. This is presumably the place where Lancelot of the Lake is later raised, at first not knowing his real parentage, by Viviane. Nevertheless, in the French romances, only the narration of the Vulgate Lancelot actually makes it clear that it's Lady of the Lake and Viviane are in fact the one and the same character. There she also uses other names, including Elaine, and this goes back to her youth as she was growing up. And, a lot of this does come from Italy and Rome in general, because the Romans did have a part and had Britain at one time. That was part of their empire. So this would explain why you would have these influences over in Britain. Giver of Excalibur. Another unnamed Lady of the Lake appears in the post-Vulgate tradition to bestow the magic sword Excalibur from Avalon to Arthur. In a new iconic scene, she is presented as a mysterious early benefactor of the young King Arthur, who is directed and led to her by Merlin. Appearing in her lake, she grants him Excalibur and its special scabbard. After original, also unnamed, sword breaks in a duel against the king, Pellinore. She is a mysterious character who is eventually neither Morgan nor the damsel huntress, but may possibly have a connection to the Lady of Avalon, Dame d'Avalon, from the prophetess de Merlin, later in the post-Vulgate suit, Du Merlin. This Lady of the Lake is suddenly attacked and beheaded at King Arthur's court by Sir Balin as a result of a kin feud between them. She blames Balin for the deletion of, variably, either her brother or her lover, while he blames her for the deletion of his mother, who had been burned at the stake, and a dispute over another enchanted sword from Avalon. Her body later vanishes. All this takes place during the time when Merlin is still at Arthur's side, and prior to the introduction of the young Viviane in the same branch of the post-Vulgate cycle. Modern retellings, however, usually omit the episode of her apparent deletion by Balin, and at the same time often make her the same character as Viviane. And there seems to be some confusion here, where this character seems to be repeated, and when I was looking over this, I was thinking it had to be multiple ladies of the lake, and that's the one that I'm going with, these mermaid, fairy type, interdimensional beings, and they're appearing as multiple different people, perhaps even clones of each other. So, in my opinion, it's multiple ladies of the lake. In Thomas Malory's Le Matar d'Arthur, a 15th century completion of the Arthurian series that is often considered definitive in much of the world today, the First Lady of the Lake remains unnamed besides this epithet. When the young King Arthur, accompanied by his mentor, Merlin, comes to her lake, she holds the replacement Excalibur, the original sword from the stone having been recently been broken in battle, out of the water, and offers it to Arthur. So they're in a boat, and they see this lady, just her arm and her hand come out the water and hand him a sword. If he promises to fulfill any request from her later, so she gives him the sword, and then asks him to fulfill any request that she has later, and to which he agrees to this. Later, when the lady comes to Camelot to receive her end of the bargain, she asks for the head of Sir Balin, the savage whom she blames for her brother's deletion. However, Arthur refuses this request. Instead, it is Balin claiming that, by enchantment and sorcery, she has been the destroyer of many good knights. Then what he does next is he swiftly decapitates her with his own magic sword, a cursed blade that had been stolen by him from a mysterious lady from Avalon just a moment earlier, in front of Arthur, and then sends off his squire with her severed head, much to the distress and shame of the king. Under those protection, she should have been there. Arthur gives the lady a rich burial as her slayer banished, despite Merlin telling him Balin would become Arthur's greatest knight, and gives his permission for Sir Lancelot of Ireland, an Irish prince, similarly named, but entirely unrelated to Malory's Lancelot, to go after Balin to avenge this disgrace by deleting him. The second Lady of the Lake is sometimes referred to by her title and sometimes referred to by name, today best known as Nimue, Nynaeve, in the Malory's original Winchester manuscript, Le Morte. Malory does not use Nimue's name for the Lady of the Lake associated with Lancelot, who remains unnamed as well, described as only one of the ladies of the lake, and she may thus be considered a third one. It is also possible that Malory had only access to the Suit de Merlin part of the post-Vulgate cycle as relevant source. Nimue, whom Malory describes as the chief lady of the lake, plays a pivotal role in the Arthurian court. Throughout his story, the first time character named Nimue appears is at the wedding of Arthur and Guinevere, as the young huntress rescued by Pellinore. She then proceeds to perform some of the same actions as a lady of the lake of his sources, but is different in some ways. For instance, in the post-Vulgate suit, Du Merlin, Malory's source for the earlier parts of the Le Morte d'Arthur, the Lady of the Lake traps Merlin in a tomb, which results in his deletion. She does this out of cruelty and hatred for Merlin. In Le Morte d'Arthur, on the other hand, Nimue is still the one that traps Merlin, but Malory gives her a sympathetic reason. Merlin falls in love with her and will not leave her alone. Malory gives no indication that Nimue loves him back. Eventually, since she cannot free herself of him otherwise, she decides to trap him under a rock and make sure he cannot escape. She is tired of his advances and is afraid of his power as a devil's son, so she does not have much of a choice but to ultimately get rid of him. So basically, this is referring to his nature with women and his advances. And in the other video, I'll talk about Merlin, and basically I've talked about this in shorts, but his mother was a nun, and his father is one of the interdimensional demonic beings in Legends. So he's half human and half that, but in Legends, he chose to be a Christian and to not do those things, but of course he would still have the sinful nature, especially have characteristics of that. So yeah, that's very interesting. And as I was saying in the previous part of the video about Merlin being entrapped in the tree, after enchanting Merlin, Malory's Nimue replaces him as Arthur's magician, aide, and trusted advisor when Arthur himself is in need. In Malory's texts, some incarnation of the Lady of the Lake or her magic or her agent reaches out to help him. For instance, she saves Arthur from a magical attempt on his life made by his sister Morgan Le Fay. Well, that's a really nice relative. And from the deletion at the hands of Morgan's lover, Avalon, as the post-Vulgate, and together with Tristan, frees Arthur from the lustful sorceress and nowhere. In a motif taken from Prose Tristan in Malory's revision, Brandon of the Isles, renamed Brian, is Nimue's evil cousin rather than her paramour. Nimue instead becomes the lover and eventually wife of a gentle young knight whom she then also puts under a protection so that he was never slain by her days. In analysis by Kenneth Hodges, Nimue appears through the story as the chivalric code changes, hinting to the reader that something new will happen in order to help Arthur achieve the wanted interpretation of the Arthurian legend. Each time the lady reappears in Le Morte d'Arthur, it is a pivotal moment in the episode, establishing the importance of her character within Arthur and the Arthurian literature, as she transcends any notoriety achieved to her character by aiding Arthur and the other knights. to succeed in their endeavors, subtlety, helping sway the court in the right direction. According to Hodges, when Malory was looking at the other texts to find inspiration, he chose the best aspects of all the other ladies of the lake characters, making her pragmatic, compassionate, clever, and strong-willed. However, Nimue's character is often seen as still very ambiguous by other scholars, as summarized by Amy S. Kaufman. There is another lady of the lake, and she has a very interesting name, and it's spelled Nynyve. And she is one of the characters they're about to discuss, and though she is sometimes friendly to Arthur and his knights, she is equally liable to act in her own interest. She can also be capricious. She has been identified as a deceptive, anti-patriarchal, equally as often as she has been cast as benevolent aid to Arthur's court, or even the literary descendant of a protective goddess. Brings Arthur home to Avalon. So basically, the ladies of the lake took Arthur to Avalon after he was mortally wounded or deleted, and this is the explanation. In the end, a female hand emerges from the lake, reclines Excalibur, in a miraculous scene when the sword is thrown into the water by Sir Benevere. Just after Arthur's final battle, Malory's narration then continues. Nimue among the magical queens, who arrive in a black boat with Morgan in the original account in the Vulgate Cycles. Mort Artu, the chief lady of the boat, seen holding hands with Morgan and calling for Arthur, is not recognized by Gerflit, who is the scene's witness. Instead of Malory's Benevere, together they bear the mortally wounded Arthur away to Avalon. So that is the final scene of Arthur. He is either deleted or almost deleted, and they go on a boat and they take him away to Avalon. And this reminds me of in scripture when they talk about Elijah being brought into heaven in a whirlwind of chariots of fire, and it is thought now that the chariots of fire is some sort of UFO, and in this legend, of course, it is possible that these interdimensional beings were bringing him through a UFO or spacecraft type object. And it could have been a boat, but it's also interesting to think about. It could have been some other technology that they mistaken for something else, in my opinion, in this legend. Also, it reminds me of the Valkyries that would bring fallen warriors to Valhalla in Norse mythology. In other identities, in some cases, it is uncertain whether Morgan and Lady of the Lake are identical or separate characters. Richard Cavendish wrote, "It may be that the two sides of Morgan's nature separated into two different characters, and that the Lady of the Lake is an aspect of Morgan herself. If so, the two fays represent the two aspects, fertile and destructive, motherly and murderous, loving and cruel." According to Anne Berthelot, Morgan herself should be considered the Lady of the Lake, as compared to the upstart magician Viviane in the French prose cycles. The 13th to 14th century English poem of Arthur in Merlin explicitly gives the role of Lady of the Lake to Morgan, explaining her association with the name Nimue by just having her residing near a town called Nimue. Morgan is also depicted as a fairy from a lake, with an underwater and invisible castle that can be accessed only with a guide, water dragon, in the Italian tale Cantieri del Faso Scudo, and as a former student of her fellow fairy Viviane in the French romance Clarisse et Loris. So this is interesting that her identity is associated with Morgan, the goddess, and that makes sense because she was in their mythology over in the Celtic lands, and I think that is very likely the origin of it, but it's still interesting in the canon sense of Viviane, or perhaps Viviane is an identity of Morgan and it's a disguise. Both may be canon in this legend, in my opinion. A number of locations are traditionally associated with the Lady of the Lakes' abode. Such places within Great Britain, including the lakes Dowsbury Pool, the Low in Cornwall, and the lakes Lynn and Lindall, and including Lynn and also Ogwen, Snowdonia, River Brews area of Pomparles Bridge, Somerset, and the Lake Loch Arthur in Scotland. It's interesting that Loch, where the Loch Ness Monster myth comes from, that is also where the ladies of the lake may have been in legends. In France, Viviane is also connected with Brittany's Paimpont forest, often identified as Arthurian enchanted forest of Broceliande, where her lake, that is the Lake of Diana, is said to be located at the castle Chateau de Comper. The oldest location of the lake is in the Lancelot en prose, written around 1230. The place where Lancelot is raised is described there as the north of Tresquenault on the Loire, in the middle of the now extinct forest of Belforant Valley, the Bois and Val of the book. So that is some of the locations where the King Arthur legend allegedly took place. And it's interesting to have these real locations. And a lot of the forests were cut down. And especially in Ireland, just for the record, they cut a lot of their forests down. And also in these King Arthur lands, a lot of the forests were cut down too, in those regions. You know, in Wales. So basically, that is summarizing about the Lady of the Lake. And that is the whole thing about it. Everything you need to know. And her name, the origins of her name, we talked about earlier, how she is Viviane and Nimue, and there are these different ones, and her origins with the Roman goddesses, and also the goddesses from the Celtic people. And as I've talked about the interdimensional beings, and how, you know, the aliens and stuff like that, so it's interesting in this mythology how it's something similar in my opinion, because we see aliens and they claim to have seen these gods and goddesses. And also about King Arthur and her relation with Merlin, and the canonical logic behind this in the legends, and also the sword Excalibur coming from the water. So that was very interesting, and we have reached the end of the video, and thank you all for watching. Another thing I want to point out is really cool, her connection to Morgan as well, and the personalities of some of the different ladies of the lake. Thank you all for watching. Have a great day, or night.